Thank you all for being here, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm impressed by your hospitality and by the precious intellectual connections you have been cultivating here. The history of computing is typically told in ways that privilege influential actors supported by powerful institutions in metropolitan centers. Mainstream histories focus on models of computing that have become the dominant ones. And some computational models are now so dominant that they are often even regarded as universal. Today I want to show how even the most foundational computational models are not universal and can be reimagined in radically different ways. I will do so by offering counter-histories of computing. I will focus on peripheral actors who imagined and developed unorthodox computational models that were ignored, suppressed, or marginalized. I will consider I will consider counter-histories of 4 major kinds of computational models, all of which are adopted by ubiquitous digital technologies. The most basic is mathematical logic, so every computer program or algorithm is composed by a sequence of logical operations. Another is the Turing machine, the abstract model of binary computation with zeros and ones, which is at the basis of all modern digital computing. I will also consider models of information, particularly those in the field of information retrieval, which is at the basis of all modern search engines like Google or Baidu. And finally, models of language, for example, those used for machine translation or conversational automata like ChatGPT. So each of these models is based on certain assumptions. A mathematical logic tends to assume absolute consistency. A statement is either true or false. Turing machines are designed for absolute certainty, and each algorithm has a determinate output, 0 or 1. Systems of information retrieval strive for a sort of neutrality. They don't want to be seen as politically partisan. And computational models of language have traditionally sought to set the poetic aspects of language aside. Poetics are not incorporated explicitly into the models, even if the outputs may be interpreted in poetic ways. So I will tell you about 4 counter-histories of computing, which challenge each of these assumptions. So my first story is about the emergence of non-classical systems of logic in Brazil. This is Newton da Costa, a Brazilian mathematician who pioneered the field of non-classical logics. This field studies systems of mathematical logic that challenge the classical commitments to absolute consistency and to a binary division of truth and falsity. Da Costa developed a prominent kind of non-classical logic called paraconsistent logic, starting in the 1950s. Paraconsistent logics are those which permit inference from inconsistent information in a non-trivial fashion. So in a paraconsistent system, a proposition P and its negation not P can be true simultaneously. But this is not the case for any proposition, because if it were, the logical system would be trivial. So a paraconsistent logic is one in which only some propositions, but not all, can be inconsistent. In short, a paraconsistent logic allows for partial contradictions. Now, this is quite abstract, but I wanted to know where this idea of partial contradictions had come from. So a few years ago, I interviewed Newton da Costa. He was 90 years old at the time and arguably remains the most influential logician in Latin America. The interview lasted several days. Now, the first day we met, he gave me a book of poetry in Portuguese titled Paraconsistência, Paraconsistency, signed by an author, a poet named Lars. He told me that Lars wanted to meet me, but wasn't able to join in person. The poems touched on intimate topics, from love and death to the existence of God, through the lens of partial contradictions. Now, at the back of the book, Lars noted that one of his inspirations was paraconsistent logic. The fact that, quote, someone from our wild land had come up with a method able of manipulating the contradictions, the chaos, the ultra-complex, unquote. Now, over time, especially after studying Newton's personal archives, I came to suspect that Newton had written the poems himself. and that Lars was his alter ego. Now, when I asked him about this, he smiled, but neither confirmed nor denied it. Now, ever since, in our correspondence, I asked Newton to send my regards to Lars. I received news from both. Now, Da Costa was not alone in seeing the world as contradictory, chaotic, and ultra-complex, or in framing Brazil, in particular, as a wild land where contradictions were especially salient. Indeed, these were common tropes in Brazilian modernist art, literature, and philosophy. Da Costa and his colleagues were deeply influenced by the Brazilian modernist movement, and I traced many connections and interactions between mathematicians and modernist artists, writers, and philosophers. Now, Brazilian modernists often argued that formal logic didn't apply to Brazil's contradictory social reality. For example, the Manifesto Antropófago, or Cannibalist Manifesto of 1928, claimed, "We never permitted the birth of logic among us." Now, this painting by Tarsila do Amaral, which accompanied the manifesto, featured a subject with a minuscule head, representing this rejection of logic as a kind of anti-colonial statement. Now, Da Costa and other mathematicians agreed that formal logic, at least in its classical Western form, was incompatible with the contradictions of social reality. So they wanted to formalize a mathematical logic that would permit contradictions. Now, this logic had consequences for the project of artificial intelligence. Brazilian researchers realized that it might be impossible to simulate human intelligence without moving beyond classical logic. For the logicians who advanced the concept of paraconsistency, classical logic was not universal, but highly particular. It was merely one of infinitely many possible forms of logic. Moreover, classical logic does not reflect the patterns of reasoning of any human being. Actually, existing rationalities are always paraconsistent, they claimed, whether the subjects were scientists or laypeople, indigenous, Brazilians, or European. Now, in this sense, the paraconsistent logicians advanced an alternative universalistic project of their own. They maintained the positive assumption that logical formalisms could somehow capture the foundations of rationality. But they moved beyond the original project by turning away from a normative ideal of absolute consistency and toward a radically inclusive description of the endlessly plural manifestations of human reasoning. Now, Brazilian mathematicians were not the only ones who, to imagine non-binary forms of logic and computation. So let's move to another story from across the world, the imagination of non-binary Turing machines in post-colonial India. In the aftermath of India's formal independence from British colonial rule, computers became part of Jawaharlal Nehru's vision of a rational post-colonial nation. A major project on digital computers was centered at the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta, which had been founded and long been directed by Bengali statistician Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis. Now, in the early 1950s, Mahalanobis and his staff embarked on a quest to import or manufacture India's first computers. By 1953, the Indian Statistical Institute had designed an analog machine that could solve simultaneous linear equations of up to 10 variables, made from materials salvaged from Second World War surplus in scrap heaps. Nehru came to see the machine, and Mahalanobis stressed that we have built it ourselves. Mahalanobis immediately started to investigate the possibility of a general-purpose digital computer, seeking help simultaneously from the United States and from the Soviet Union. Confidential documents uncovered by historian Nikhil Menon revealed that the US Department of State worked to prevent Mahalanobis from obtaining technical aid because of the department's perception of his Soviet sympathies. During this period, Mahalanobis looked to Indian philosophy in search of alternative models of logic and statistics, which would later inspire the imagination of different kinds of computers. Now, at a symposium in 1953, Mahalanobis presented what he called some ideas in the Indian Jaina theory of Syadvada, which aroused much interest. Now, what is Syadvada? According to philosopher Janardhan Ganeri, Syadvada may be understood as a theory of the conditionalization of assertion, The theory recommended conditionalizing any statement with the particle siat, which Ganneri translates as somehow, and Mahalanobis translated as maybe. There are various different accounts of the theory in ancient Sanskrit texts. Some accounts include a seven-fold division of types of statement or modes of predication. They're called sapta bangji, which were the focus of Mahalanobis' analysis. He referred to it as a logic or a dialectic, rendering and translating its 7 categories as follows. So maybe it is, maybe it's not, maybe it is and it's not, maybe it's indeterminate, maybe it is and also indeterminate, maybe it's not and also indeterminate, maybe it is and it's not and also indeterminate. Okay. So the first 3 categories, Mahalanobis noted, conform to the categories of classical logic, right? Assertion, negation, and both. Now note that Mahalanobis performed substantial interpretive work in framing the Jain theory called Syadvada as analogous to the Western category of logic, and the semantic predicates called Banji as analogous to truth values. Okay? Now neither analogy is self-evident, and both rest on some measure of simplification. But in any case, the 4th category, avakta, is even harder to translate. Mahalanobis chose to translate it as indeterminate, noting that other authors also used indescribable, inexpressible, or indefinite. Now, Mahalanobis saw avakta as analogous to the concept of mathematical probability. Now, a few years later, this reinterpretation of the theory of Syadvada would inspire an effort to imagine a non-binary model of computation, replacing binary logic with a 7-fold theory of predication. This line of work, initiated by Mahalanobis, was advanced in collaboration with British-born biologist J.B.S. Haldane. Numerous Western scientists visited India, especially the Indian Statistical Institute, in the aftermath of independence. One example is Norbert Wiener, the founding figure of cybernetics, who imagined that India could become the site of a scientifically advanced and technologically automated future, since Nehru could follow what he called an alternative path to industrialization through the early introduction of the automatic factory. But Haldane went further. He didn't just visit India for a semester or a year. He moved permanently, becoming a professor at the Indian Statistical Institute and eventually an Indian citizen. This move was linked to his anti-colonial politics. In 1956, days after the United Kingdom, France, and Israel attacked Egypt in an attempt to seize control of the Suez Canal, Haldane resigned from his post at University College London. He told the Times newspaper, "I do not want to be a citizen here any longer because Britain is a criminal state." So he moved to India, studied Sanskrit, and joined Mahalanobis in reimagining computers through the lens of Jainism. Now, existing digital computers, whether British or Soviet, were based on binary logic. This had been the case since the earliest digital computers, such as the ENIAC, completed in 1945. Now, Alan Turing's mathematical model of computation from 1936, which has since become known as the Turing machine, also assumed binary operations. It consisted of a memory tape divided into discrete cells, each of which could contain one of 2 symbols, 0 or 1. Now, Haldane envisioned a machine that would support avakta in addition to 0 and 1. He wrote, such a machine could give any of 7 responses, namely 0, 1, avakta, 0 or 1, 0 or avakta, 1 or avakta, 0 or 1 or avakta. Okay? So in effect, this was a non-binary Turing machine. Now, this abstract model never materialized into an actual physical computer. And today's computers are almost invariably based on binary logic. There were a few exceptions, notably in the Soviet Union, around the mid to late 20th century. Now, there were many reasons that contributed to the dominance of the binary model, but in principle, non-binary computers, even computers based on different philosophies, are possible. Now, I've presented cases of very theoretical and abstract fields of computing. Now I will turn to a third case about a more practical and applied field, the distinctive field of informatics as it developed in post-revolutionary Cuba. In the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Fidel Castro appointed librarian Maria Teresa Freire de Andrade as the new director of the José Martí National Library in Havana. A lesbian and longtime dissident who had been exiled and jailed by the previous regimes, she had long been concerned with the politics of librarianship. After the revolution, Freire de Andrade argued that Cubans could not simply, in her words, copy what the English do in their libraries. By doing so, she said, we would have a magnificent library. We would have it very well classified. We would provide a good service to many people, but we would not be taking an active part in what the revolution is. So what did she mean? How could librarians take an active part in the revolution? Now, one answer was to gather and index materials that had been excluded and suppressed from library collections in the pre-revolutionary period, such as publications of the clandestine revolutionary press of the 1950s. But librarians also became involved in a broader revolutionary project, Cuba's effort to build its own computing industry and information infrastructure. This project ultimately led to a distinctive new field of information science, which inherited some of the revolutionary ideals of Cuban librarianship. Now, both the revolutionaries and their enemies recognized that information technology would be a strategic priority for the new Cuba. In 1962, IBM closed its Cuban branch, and the US government imposed a trade embargo that prevented Cuba from acquiring any computer equipment. This meant that Cuba would be forced to develop its own computing industry with help from other socialist countries in the Soviet-led Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or COMECON. Now, in 1970, a team at the University of Havana created a prototype of a digital computer, the CID-201, as well as a programming language named LEAL, short for Lenguaje Algorítmico, or algorithmic language, an acronym which also means loyal. Because of the US imposed trade embargo, the team could not buy the necessary electronic components in Europe, but eventually succeeded with the help of a Cuban man of Japanese descent who worked as a merchant in Tokyo in bringing the components from Japan hidden inside briefcases. Now, what's remarkable about Cuban informatics is how it developed new theories and mathematical models that diverged from those of both US and Soviet informatics. Cuban information scientists tried to encode their political ideals into their mathematical models of library activity. The Cuban models are often much more complex. I won't go into the mathematical details here, but I just want to make a brief note about their underlying political principles. So US and Soviet information scientists often used metrics of popularity, like citation counts, to choose which materials to keep and which to discard. Cuban information scientists rejected those metrics of popularity. They were deeply concerned with ensuring a diversity of points of view in library collections. The point is that they understood that systems of information retrieval can never be neutral. When an algorithm chooses how to rank search results or selects which videos to recommend on a feed, this is always a normative decision with political consequences. And Cuban information scientists embraced this inevitable political partiality. Now, when I did research on Cuban informatics, there was almost no material that I could find easily available online, at least in English. And after the publication of my first article about it, Wikipedia editors almost immediately, like literally the next day after the online publication, immediately contacted me and created new entries on Freire de Andrade and the CID-201 computer. I'm quite honored to have played a role in the public documentation of this history, and glad to have this first-hand experience with the politics of information systems. Now, the Cuban experiments in informatics were supported by a socialist state. But I should also note and present a case in which a more authoritarian socialist state repressed alternative experiments, forcing them to move underground. So my last story is about machine poetics in former Czechoslovakia. Computational models of language have always tended to focus on the most on the basic and literal aspects of language, and to suppress or set aside the poetic and aesthetic aspects. Warren Weaver, the US scientist who was arguably the first proponent of machine translation, put it this way in 1955. No reasonable person thinks that a machine translation can ever achieve elegance and style. Pushkin need not shudder. Now, that's why the earliest projects of machine translation focused on scientific and technical documents during the Cold War. Scientific prose was perceived as simpler, more direct, and easier to translate. Now, this tendency persists in present-day machine translation systems and conversational automata, which are based on metrics of semantic similarity, but do not consider poetics explicitly in the design of the models. Now, in former Czechoslovakia, the early projects in machine translation and computational linguistics also conformed to this tendency overall. However, at the margins of those projects, there were surprising exceptions. Linguists, engineers, writers, and scholars worked to appropriate the very first computers in Czechoslovakia for literary purposes and to develop language models which explicitly incorporated poetics. Czech literary theorist G.D. Levy sought to formalize the aesthetic decisions in the process of translation, using various mathematical models like information theory, game theory, and statistical decision theory. Unlike US and Soviet projects of machine translation, Levy imagined that computers could be used for translating literary texts, including poetry. Another linguist, Květa Zgalova, was inspired by Levy's critique of mainstream computational linguistics and worked on probabilistic models of poetic language. Now, why did this sort of work emerge in Czechoslovakia? Now, one precondition was the intellectual influence of the Prague linguistic circle from the pre-war period, which had theorized the poetic or aesthetic function of language. For later Czech structuralists like Levy, language could be divided into two structures, the semantic and the aesthetic, which were equally amenable to mathematical formalization. Now, most of the published works that developed mathematical or computational models of poetic language appeared in the mid-1960s. Earlier in the 50s, structural linguistics had been seen as controversial by the Soviet-aligned regime because of late Stalinist polemics that had framed structural linguistics as incompatible with Marxism. Many linguists were purged from Czechoslovak universities. Some were exiled, while others renounced structuralism publicly and pledged allegiance to Marxism. The brief period when political repression loosened in the mid-1960s is when most publications about machine poetics appeared. Now, some of this work involved using computers to automatically compose poetry. A few people even deployed computer-generated poetry as a mode of political critique. So during the Prague Spring in 1968, one researcher collected official statements by a very high-ranking politician, then used the computer to generate absurd lines with parodic, official-sounding statements. Now, the results were published in a magazine article titled Generative Degeneration, just a few months before the tragic Warsaw Pact invasion. But after the invasion and subsequent repression, most researchers of machine poetics were punished and removed from academic positions. In a few cases, researchers were punished at least in part because of the perception of their work as subversive. This seems to be the case with the author of Generative Degeneration. In other cases, researchers were punished mostly for their personal views and actions, not so much for their academic work. But this seems to be the case with Zgalova, who was removed from her faculty position and allowed to work only as a librarian. Now, for one reason or another, almost everyone who worked on machine poetics could not continue doing so in universities after the invasion. Now, this did not mean that the research stopped completely. During the 70s and 80s, a group of people interested in mathematical studies of poetic language, including Zgalova, organized underground meetings in different apartments around Prague. This was informally called the Evening School of Versology, which circulated their findings in self-published typescript, or samizdat. Well, Dorota Olszewska, a former student of mine who supported my research through an internship, visited Květa Zgalova in Prague last year for a preliminary interview in one of the apartments where those underground meetings happened half a century ago. Zgalova still considers her research on poetic language the most important work of her life. Still, she was surprised that we had learned of her work's existence after such a long time and from far away in the Netherlands. So she was also curious about what sort of research we were doing, so Dorota sent her my article on Cuban informatics. After reading a machine translation of my article, she agreed to help us and even searched her apartment for old correspondence. Now, ironically, this encounter wouldn't have been possible without language models in their existing commercially available anti-poetic forms. Now, I first learned of Zgalova's ideas by reading papers machine translated from Czech. And I now know from Dorota's more careful translations that I had missed or misunderstood various things. But from the beginning, despite the limitations of mainstream machine translation, I could still sense what was important, even beautiful, about the work. Now, a computational model can try to suppress the poetically, but cannot do so fully. And this is part of a more general pattern in all of my stories. Computational models can be designed to suppress the inconsistent, the uncertain, the partisan, and the poetic, but they never succeed completely. Despite all the attempts to get rid of inconsistency, uncertainty, politics, and poetics in models of computing, there are always people who raise objections. There are even people who express those objections by developing alternative computational models. There are always people who imagined ways of computing otherwise. So I suppose that includes the extraordinary community I met this week in Shanghai. Thank you for listening.
非常感谢Rodrigo为我们带来特别有意思的4个案例，让我们看到在这种所谓的正统的计算模型之外，还有非常多充满想象力的、充满解放力的，甚至是非常富有诗意的这种另类的可能性。那我们接下来就把时间留给场上的观众，然后大家有什么想问的，可以直接举手示意。
你好，就首先非常谢谢你的演讲，然后您就是刚才分享的案例，某种程度上是主流之外的一种计算机曾经的历史上的一种叙事，然后它也涵盖了计算机模型以及控制论等相关的内容。而我之前也做过一些跟控制论相关的一些研究，我当时做的是美国、苏联和中国3个国家控制论传播过程的一些类比，然后所以我看到您的这个分享，就是觉得他们是可以放在一起去进行比较的，但是我有一个一直很困扰的点，就是我在做研究的时候发现，不管是智利也好，苏联也好，这些中国也好，这些另类的叙事最后都被收束到了那个主流的叙事里。在新自由主义开始之后，就是它都变成了一种历史遗产性质的东西。所以我一直很想知道这些另类的文化它有什么在今天可以实践的方向，就是那个落地的可能也好，或者是我们可以实际做的事情也好，而不是仅仅成为历史遗产。这个一直是我很想知道的一个问题，所以很想问您有没有一些对这个问题的解答，或者是有一些可以分享的实践方向、项目，或者艺术小组等等，有没有这方面的案例可以分享？谢谢。
Okay, great. That's a great question. So, it is true that when I look for historical cases of unorthodox models, a good deal of the things that I find were things that whose ideas ended up getting incorporated into like kind of mainstream models of computing in one way or another, right? It's difficult to find something that fits all of my criteria, and one of which I think it is I look for cases that help us defamiliarize the models that are prevailing today, right? I explicitly look for those cases where in which some basic assumption that came to be treated as universal and that people don't question was questioned. Right? And usually you find you find that mode of questioning very early on, right? When a certain formal model kind of begins to circulate worldwide in one way or another. Now, I would be super curious to learn about your research and in control theory and the comparisons from cases around the world, and especially the empirical material that you find that you found in China. And in general, I would be very excited if there were people here interested in doing research into unorthodox forms of computing that have been developed in China. I think that's very much. I would imagine that there's a lot of stuff, right? A lot of really fascinating stories yet to be told, and if I can support those efforts in any way, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I would do. I will do all I can, given the, within the constraints of anti-poetic mainstream machine translation, to support that line of work. Now, one of the reasons why I do this work too is that I want to inspire experiments with different ways of computing now. Right? I see this kind of historical work. And ethnographic work as a strategy, to help people imagine, right? To give a concrete example of how things could have looked otherwise, even if they were not, fully implemented, even if they did not succeed, even if those were abandoned ideas, there may still be elements of those ideas that people can take up now and can inspire people to do experiments, including, they don't necessarily need to be, kind of pragmatic or utilitarian experiments of actually developing, platforms for widespread use, even though that would also be really cool. They can even be artistic experiments, right? For, just to show a concept or show how some of those ideas could be expressed now. And yeah, there have been a few of those experiments in a kind of artistic direction. That was a kind of unexpected experience for me. Because so earlier this year I presented some of this material, some of these stories in Latin America for the first time, which was really significant for me. I presented it in São Paulo in Brazil, which is where I was born. I was very glad to be able to give a talk in Portuguese. I don't get to do that very often. And to my surprise, and it was for it's for a group of kind of local activists and artists. And to my surprise, a bunch of people, were inspired and started doing little artistic experiments, inspired by those case studies. But also, to my surprise, they all focused on the same one. Like the Indian case, the non-binary Turing machine. Like pretty much, there were maybe 5 different groups that did some artistic experiment based on these cases, and they were kind of all about the second story. In any case, this is also, these kinds of experimentation, artistic and technological experimentation, are things that, I am also very happy to support in however ways I can. Right? Although I am a programmer and I do have a kind of background in computer science, that's not the. I am certainly not an artist, and I just don't have the same sensibility that people like you do, and I understand that it's very hard. But if people who do have that sensibility, people who are artists and are skilled at this kinds of experimentation, want to take these ideas up. Yeah, I'm entirely on board, and I will do whatever I can to support. Yeah, thank you.
好的，下一个问题。
谁这是？
Hello? Okay. I was curious, so talking about the non-binary logic, I mean, so, for instance, early AI, symbolic AI, was very much hoping that, classical logic would lead you to all the things we want AI to do.
Yeah.
That largely did not work out,
Right.
A lot of it.
Yeah.
And when statistical AI started to rise 30 years ago,
Yeah.
my naive understanding, I'm not a mathematician at all, but isn't some of that about dealing with uncertainty and probabilities rather than strict logical statements? And I'm wondering what the difference is between more statistical approaches that are used today and the non-binary logics you're talking about. I was also curious why you see modern automatic translations being anti-poetic rather than neutral or not trying to be poetic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah, yes. Yeah, these are very helpful questions. So the Brazilian mathematicians who were involved in pair-consistent logic, when they had their critique of what they saw as the bulk of work in AI, they very much had this kind of symbolic AI approach that you mentioned in mind, right? This was at a time that kind of preceded the rise of these more probabilistic approaches to artificial intelligence. Now, it is true that, the formalism of mathematical probability, is a way of dealing with uncertainty. And, the kind of history of science literature on the history of mathematical probability is a particularly extraordinary one. I'd say like that, that's one of the topics that's been covered kind of like most deeply out of, like any, out of pretty much any topic you can find in like history of mathematical formalisms. So I guess that's one of the reasons why I didn't choose to historicize that in particular. But it's true that Mahalanobis, it was to mathematical probability that Mahalanobis initially drew the analogy, right? Like when he read this, when he first drawing analogies between the Jane theory and mathematical concepts, the first analogy he drew was to mathematical probability because of the uncertainty aspect. And it's kind of only later on, a few years later, that the analogy to, like a possible alternative form of a Turing machine that came up. Now, insofar as how that guides my work, that's, I chose this case, and I chose this story because it has this, like underlying theme of a radical epistemological rupture, right, involved in a way that maybe mathematical probability doesn't quite have. Now, even another thing I should say is that non-classical logic formalisms, some of which are better known, like fuzzy logic, that look a little bit closer to mathematical probability because you represent a truth value as a real number between 0 and 1. Those were also seen as a little bit controversial when they first came up. When they first came up, and in fact, I did find a story where Lotfi Zadeh, the mathematician who came up with fuzzy logic, actually met Newton da Costa at Berkeley in the 1970s, and they had, like a little bit of a shared experience with having their mathematical work be dismissed in one way or another as either pseudo-logic or not logic. Right? Now, on statistical approaches to AI and probabilistic approaches to AI, one of the reasons why I'm not ready to call this book project completed is that I really want to have a case about an unorthodox model that diverges in some interesting way from artificial neural networks. Like I think that would be I think that I see that as a kind of missing piece in the story I want to tell, because of, not only because of just how influential those models are now, but I think that if for the types of philosophical claims I want to be able to make with this material, I think that some neural network story would be really good to have. Yeah.
感谢 Rodrigo 的回答。那么到目前为止，我们网研所第8届网络社会年会的日程就基本上结束了。那么最后有请黄尊全老师为我们做一个简短的总结，谢谢。
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's really good. 我相信大家都累了，然后有点疲劳。我非常感激各位能够来到杭州的各位朋友。老实说，你们都知道，在中国让事情发生并不是太容易，特别是让有趣的事情发生并不是太容易，你需要经过很多折磨跟安排。但让事情发生本身就具有意义。我们安排了很多次年会，每一次年会都有一些不同的目的啊。这2天其实我自己学到很多。第一场我们透过艺术家的角度去重新思考整个科技艺术界某种潮流化的表现。昨天下午那场其实有点意思啊，就是他们其实是可以吵架的。因为我非常希望 Anna 在讲话的时候，2个来自加州帕拉奥特的地方的人可以跟 Anna 一些对话等等。可惜他们今年他们昨天Anna 没有办法来，她本来答应要来也没办法来，等等。那其实就很可惜，包含 Before 也是。那今天上午就更有趣了，就是一个工程师讲了一些我们艺术家或者人文学院很难想象的那种愿景，而且真的把它做出来。然后 Mark Webber 从互联网的历史跟界面来理解这个清楚，来理解这整个从很早以前我们人类开始对符号、对媒介的使用，到今天为止的一些发展。然后最后呢 ，Rodrigo 给我们一个非常好的，我都不能说他是，我觉得说反省还不太够，因为我们太习惯这种 ubiquitous 的世界了，就我们太喜欢那种统一性的世界，最好有一个 ubiquitous 的模型，然后有统一论的东西，就好像我们都用 Type C 的接口一样，全世界如果都变成 Type C 就好了。可是恰恰不是如此。那今天的学术界也好，科技界也好，整个发展其实是越来越集中化的。所以我觉得最后一个演讲反而提醒我们，其实历史上有很多这种历史的碎片存在，然后我们更要努力去找到这种 history in historical moment， 就是你要在那个历史的时间段里头，重要的时间点里头找到历史，那我们才有办法让这个picture 变得更完整。这也是我们今天的题目为什么叫做 impossibilities， 就 IM， 然后有个quotation， 有一个括号的叫 impossibilities。我们永远是在这个 impossibilities 里头找到可以实现的 possibilities 啊。这是我们年会为什么要做反文化跟用这个题目的原因。那我再次感谢各位朋友，然后尽管我们现场的人不多，但因为我们有直播，所以有很多人可以在网络上听到各位的演讲。那之后我们也会把每一个讲者的演讲稿整理出来，会对外公布。因为网研所我们办的所有的活动的演讲都一定是对外公布的，所以我们会留下比较完整的记录，也好好的整理各位的发言。那最后我还非常感谢我们辛苦的那个我非常感谢我们辛苦的工作人员，我们有非常多的 broadcasting team， 还有一些招待的 team， 还有各种翻译跟工作，所以我希望各位可以在这里谢谢我们的工作人员，你们辛苦了的。OK， 那就这样吧。然后希望我们有机会在世界任何角落再碰到你们，然后再跟你们请教，我们一起看看如何让世界变得更有趣。这是我最想做的事情。这样 OK， 谢谢各位。